Another huge news event, a big resignation, a bad day for the government, and I'm very pleased to say an emergency episode of Talking Politics. So we recorded an earlier episode of this podcast in which Robert and I, if you listened or watched, you will have noticed that Robert and I were pretty incredulous about the fact that Peter Mandelson was still in position as our ambassador to Washington. I think our incredulity, as I'm sure did yours, grew as the day progressed. And when Robert was live on News at 10 last night, we had a chat after he'd finished off camera in which we both really couldn't believe that he was still in place at that point in the evening, and we both thought he'd be gone in the morning, and indeed he was. That's not to say that you needed a huge degree of political insight or anything else, or that we have a huge degree of political insight. I think pretty much everyone in the country knew that Peter Mandelson's days, indeed hours, were numbered. There's an awful lot to talk about. Where does it leave the government? Where does it leave Keir Starmer? Robert, what I was going to say was that as it happened, as the resignation was announced, I found myself thinking really hard about what this said about the government. Is this just in the category of another government complete cock-up, disaster, reflects badly? And I thought, well, that's partly true, but I wanted to sort of put to you and debate, I guess, is there an argument for the fact that this shows the government is actually improving in a weird way? We have so often discussed the lack of political instinct, their inability to apparently see things that every political journalist and frankly most people in the country would say is staring them in the face. They can't act even when it's obvious they must act. And here, yeah, they were a bit late, should have done it yesterday, but they got there quicker than they have done in the past. How do you assess this whole episode? Let's just take it as a given. It's not good for Keir Starmer. He appointed Peter Mandelson. That was a disaster. But does it show that they are smartening up their ability to respond to things that are blindingly obvious to the rest of us?
I mean, maybe. I have to say that is a slightly counterintuitive interpretation. Look, yes, let's be absolutely clear. It became blindingly obvious. I mean, it's been pretty clear to me for several days that Mandelson's position was unsustainable. As soon as I saw the birthday message, the 10-page birthday message that Mandelson sent to Epstein, and that was published by the House of Representatives Oversight Committee in Washington. I think that was on Tuesday. As soon as I got hold of that birthday message, I did assume that Mandelson was going to be toast, and here we are. It feels like a lifetime later, but it isn't that much later, and he's gone. And yeah, there is a new sort of director of comms in Tim Allen in Downing Street. There's no question about he's a pro. They've handled what is a disaster, arguably better than previous disasters in the life of this government have been handled. But I don't think there's much in the events of the last 24 hours to really prove that this government is getting the kind of grip that would persuade people that it's in charge of events rather than being buffeted. And I guess the questions that are, in a sense, so damaging for Starmer about the appointment of Peter Mandelson, they are very serious ones. I mean, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday in the podcast, but I think it's just worth going over these again, right? The world and his wife knew that Peter Mandelson was going to be a very high-risk appointment. Twice before in Peter Mandelson's career, he had been sacked from high office, in those cases, ministerial office, as a result of transgressions related to being way too friendly with the super wealthy, right? He had history, he had form. This is in his DNA. He does this stuff, right? He's an unbelievably effective political operator, but, he may be a brilliant political operator, but you don't make the gamble of appointing somebody like that, against a backdrop where you can be pretty confident that it's all going to end in tears unless you've got no choice, right? And the fact is, Keir Starmer had a really easy choice. The person in office, Karen Pierce, was, everybody said, both, whether it's members of the cabinet, whether it was officials at the Foreign Office, whether it was members of Trump's team, they all thought she was doing a brilliant job. She could and should have stayed in the job for at least another year. Yes, she'd been there a long time. Yes, if the normal rules had been followed, and this wasn't exceptional. It wasn't exceptional in the sense that we had this really complicated challenge of a new President Trump, who doesn't play by the normal rules, right? There was an argument that if this was a normal embassy appointment, it was time for her to move on. But there was nothing normal about the circumstances. Everybody was saying to Keir Starmer, keep her in place for another year. And he did not take that advice, right? And given that Keir Starmer is one of the more risk-averse politicians that I know, and has never historically been close to Peter Mandelson, right? All of this is just mind-boggling, right? This harm that has been done to the government by the circumstances of Mandelson's departure, it is all on Keir Starmer, all of it. Right, and he's now got to explain what the hell, why did he take this crazy risk? Because it looked crazy at the time, and now it looks borderline insane.
Well, I think we know why he took the risk, don't
why?
we?
Why do you think? Well, why do you think he took the risk? Because I don't understand it. Because Pierce was doing a brilliant job. So why take the risk?
Well, because firstly, with the greatest respect to you, there is one bit of this story that we're leaving out, which is that
what's that?
Gordon Brown brought Peter Mandelson back in when as you will well remember, when his government was faltering. And I think even Peter Mandelson's harshest critics would say that he did a pretty good job of stabilizing that premiership in its final days.
All right. Okay. But I'm going to pick you up on that. That's fine. But hang on. That's fine. That is fine. No. That is fine. But I have to pick you up on that because, right? The government is saying, okay, that it went through it didn't know, it said, about these emails from Mandelson to Epstein. Basically saying to Epstein, it's all terribly unfair, you're being prosecuted for child sex abuse, and I'm with you. And it's those emails that, as I say, Keir Starmer says he had no sight of, that have done for Mandelson. But, okay, I think I talked to you about this yesterday, all right? There were public documents in a court case in America, right, that show that Mandelson was, when he was working for Gordon Brown, 2009, 2010, as business secretary, he was staying in Epstein's apartment, or his huge house, not apartment, huge house in New York. These are emails that show that Epstein was talking to Mandelson about, as business secretary, trying to facilitate a privatization, the sale of an asset owned by Royal Bank of Scotland to JP Morgan. And all of this information, you can argue that Mandelson did a brilliant job for Gordon Brown, but at the same time, there was information available to the government, which the government is implying that it saw, right, showing that Mandelson, after Epstein has been convicted of sex crimes, and Mandelson is still, very much a friend of his. So, if this information was available to the government, how on earth, did they feel it was appropriate to appoint him, despite the fact that politically, you just don't take that, that
We're not in any way disagreeing. I think it was, if the question is, should they have hired him? The answer is obviously no. And, partly that's because we've been around politics a long time. And it's interesting. You mentioned Tim Allen. We shouldn't assume knowledge on the audience. We should explain Tim Allen. If you've ever watched The Thick of It, that isn't Tim Allen. He's not the Malcolm Tucker, screamy, shouty, sweary character. I wouldn't precisely call him charming, but he's quite calm. But he is quite steely, and I would say he has good political instincts. And, he's done a lot of work in the private sector. I haven't looked through his client list and what he does. I should imagine there was a bit of a risk in bringing him back. I certainly wouldn't have brought back Peter Mandelson, because you and I both know Peter Mandelson pretty well. We know that, he has an extraordinary ability to network. That's his, if you like, his superpower. And we know over time that there's been some pretty unsavory characters in that network, Epstein among them. So yeah, it was an insane risk. I suppose all I'm saying is that it's a reminder of how green Keir Starmer's government was, and how, frankly, a bit clueless they looked in the early days and months about how to handle power. And honestly, I think the pointed question is, are they getting any better? And I suppose all I was saying at the start, for the point of being fair, is that marginal improvement. They didn't let this go on a week. They saw the writing on the wall, should have seen it earlier, should never have appointed him, but saw the writing on the wall. I'm sorry, it's not right to say they should never have appointed him. That's their choice. We're just both highlighting the fact that there were severe risks in appointing him, and those risks have proved to be justified. But I keep also asking myself, are we being unfair on this government? Are we imposing impossible standards? Because, as we always say, being in government is not easy and all the rest of it. But I keep thinking about, two other governments that came in that we saw through: the Blair government and the coalition government. Blair government had a huge majority. Coalition government was quite stable in its own way. It didn't have the two things that make it differ from this government to me are, one, they just had better political instincts. They seemed to sense the way the wind was blowing, to see where the public was, and to act before it became a crisis. And they were just more stable. I just am constantly amazed. How has Keir Starmer got such a massive majority, and yet we've got this sense of kind of a government that might fall at any minute? Now, maybe that's an illusion, but it's an extraordinary position for him to have to be in. And as we discussed earlier in this week, he's got a very hard autumn, and it just got harder.
Yeah. Look, I think there's another character, actually, that we do need to talk about, because it partly answers, my passionate question: how on earth did he manage to appoint him, despite the fact that there was a blatantly obvious superior route to take? And part of the explanation is Starmer's, I think controversial is the right word, controversial Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, who has been extraordinarily close to Peter Mandelson for years, who will, he's a very deft operator, McSweeney, because although there is absolutely no doubt in my mind he would have wanted Mandelson appointed, we talked yesterday on the podcast about how he did this rather clever thing of, in a sense, protecting himself from the fallout and blame by putting up George Osborne as an alternative. And we talked yesterday about how George Osborne was the sort of runner-up in this contest. Now, I've been talking to Labour figures. McSweeney has got this reputation for being, shall we say, quite a sophisticated, I think that's a euphemism, player. And one conspiracy theory for why McSweeney put up George Osborne is because he knew that Starmer would and could never appoint Osborne, because there'd be such a massive backlash from the Labour benches. that he knew that if he put up Osborne as the alternative, Starmer was bound to pick Mandelson, and therefore he sort of played Starmer. There's another explanation which just says this was all just cock up from start to finish from everybody involved, including McSweeney. But either way, it is. I think what my story broadly tells you is that MPs are themselves just scrabbling around, desperate to understand how what they do regard as a near catastrophe for the reputation of this government has happened. And, we haven't even reminded people who are listening that it's only a few days since the Deputy Prime Minister had to resign, having flunked the assessment of the ethics advisor. I mean, we've only been back from the recess, less than 2 weeks. We've lost the Deputy Prime Minister and in some ways the most high-profile political appointment that Keir Starmer has made. This is mind-boggling.
Well, do you remember how many times we were standing out in the rain in Downing Street doing live programs? Liz Truss comes, Liz Truss goes, Rishi Sunak. It was just the years of chaos. I think the one thing we probably both thought is that Keir Starmer might be a little bit dull and maybe the country needed a bit of that. And I'm not saying he's proved to be interesting in ways that would be helpful for the Labour movement so far, by and large, but it certainly is more eventful and more chaotic. And, I don't see where you place blame, if that's the right word for that, but upon his judgment. And I'm sure we'll discuss it many times, but I think it's going to be a brutal autumn. But a couple of quick points, if I may, before we go, that I want to just chat with you. One, does Keir Starmer have any choice now but to get on his knees to Karen Pierce and say, please go back, please just at least do a couple of years to stabilize the ship, make sure things are smoothed over with Trump, or does he start again?
Look, in my view, of course, he ought to ask Karen Pierce. I've no idea whether she'd agree. I think she felt a bit bruised by the whole process. So I've no idea whether she would agree. And she may already have sort of remade her life in a different kind of way. But you're right, that is one rational approach. I don't think, because, in other circumstances, if he commanded more respect on his backbenchers, and he's lost quite a lot of that recently, I think he could actually genuinely, because let's be clear, George Osborne does have the advantage that he's very close to JD Vance, which is definitely an advantage for somebody in that job. I don't think Starmer dare approach Osborne, because the revolt on his backbenchers would be off the charts, because they still, many of them actually hate him for the austerity that they feel he imposed on the country. So I don't think that's a runner. I was talking to a very, very well-placed, very knowledgeable official earlier on today. They do think that because Trump is so mercurial, so different from any president we've dealt with, that a conventional official, with the possible exception of Karen Pierce, is the wrong choice. That actually you do need somebody with political skills. Off the top of my head, if it's not Pierce and it's not Osborne, it's not obvious to me who he should be thinking. This is quite a tough appointment, to be clear. Sorry?
Crazy idea. Blair? Crazy idea.
Don't think it's paid well enough.
Cameron?
Cameron. I just think that they're going to struggle to get these through their backbench. You shouldn't forget, right, that, and again, another example of how things have really gone badly. Do you remember all the sort of candidates that they expelled in the run-up to the election? The way that they basically forced various people on, and the fact that they actually have so little control over their backbenches is sort of jaw-dropping, given the purges that they tried before the general election. he may be able to get it together. You know, they keep talking about the importance of phase 2, and we're only just into phase 2, and you can't write off phase 2 of this government so early. It's definitely not going well.
Well, all I can say is chaotic government may be poor for the country, but it's pretty entertaining for journalism. So that's not necessarily a good thing in the round, but
it's a very, 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 very bad thing in the round.
Yeah. Anyway, if you're listening or watching, thank you very much for joining us. It's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me. See you soon.